Hello and welcome back to another episode of NT Movie Reviews coming at you online and in print format at nicktiffany.com, on YouTube and all the podcast platforms at NT Movie Reviews, as well as on all social media platforms at NT Movie Reviews. Today I'm joined by director, producer, cinematographer Jessica Earnshaw, who's following up her feature film Jacinta with Baby Doe playing here at the 2025 Seattle International Film Festival. Baby Doe tells the story of a young woman in a conservative Christian community, Gail, who gave birth alone and left her newborn in the woods. Decades later, she's arrested for murder, despite her claim that the baby was stillborn. Delving into advances in DNA testing, a rise in infanticide cases, this documentary takes a personal approach when looking into pregnancy denial and how we're just starting to kind of understand that as a concept. Baby Doe is immensely affecting, and I was just incredibly impressed with how you told the story. So thank you so much for being here, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm curious, have you been anxious to get this story out and in front of people now?
Yeah, definitely. I started filming it in 2020 and our edit took longer than expected. It feels like it's been a long journey with this film. So I'm definitely very happy it's out there finally. And it's just fun to share it, with people and get responses and yeah.
No, absolutely. The film is terrific. It covers so many interesting aspects of things that we feel in our society, whether it's religious oppression, whether it is shame, and I think how you handle everything and tackle it. You just did such an effective job with that, and I'd love to know how you first got involved with this project. I know I believe it was 2019 when DNA kind of identified Gail in that case, and I know you said there was you started maybe the process in 2020. How did you get in touch with Gail, or how did you first hear about and approach the story? And then, like you mentioned, as you started filming in 2020, of course, the state of the world was pretty screwed up, and I'm just curious how that affected some of that filming process, or maybe some of that editing process too.
In 2020, I actually came across Emily Weaver's story first.
Mm.
I saw an article about her in Elle magazine, and I was very curious to learn more. It had written about pregnancy denial and how she had a life without parole sentence. So I reached out to her attorneys first, spent about a year filming with her mother, her attorneys, and spent some time talking to Emily. And then I was looking for another woman because I felt like it would be important, not, so it didn't seem just like a one-off case because there's so many of these women out there
Sure.
that I put a Google alert out and came across Gail's case. I was finding so many of these cases through the Google alert. A lot of older women getting arrested decades later. And so when I reached out to Gail, I reached out through her attorneys. Emily's attorney actually knew Gail's attorneys, and I met them in person. I wanted to make sure that Gail and her husband and family were interested in actually participating in this like fully because, um, for me, I really wanted to shed light on how this happens and really kind of tell a different narrative than what was in the news, which is often very different and very negative.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so I spent about 4 hours speaking to them in their attorney's office, and they were open to it. Actually, Gail agreed to do it because of Emily. She thought if her story could help Emily, then
Sure.
she was on board.
Okay, that's beautiful, and that is
Yeah.
really powerful considering when people see the film, just how much Emily and Gail's stories kind of intertwine in some ways, especially in that case of, life without parole.
Hmm.
I think that one of the most interesting internal troubling aspects while watching this film is the duality of, yes, Gail has lived a fairly full life. She's got children. She's with her husband. She's been a mother for years, is an active member in her church and her community. And then at the same time, when she was younger, at one point she knew that she was pregnant, but whether it was shame, whether it was fear of judgment, whether it was persecution that she might feel, it's as if, those symptoms didn't really exhibit. She wasn't, gaining the weight perhaps, or showing the bump like you might expect in some ways. And it was just fascinating that so many people around her were so clueless to it as well. and the fact that there was just
Hmm.
nothing that they knew or even suspected about it. And so reconciling at one point in the film, the judge, towards the end, he makes a comment about how he can't rationalize the two Gales and he's not going to try. And I
Hmm.
think that's what the problem is with the media, and something I'm sure that you were looking to tackle in
Hmm.
creating this film, because so much of news and so much of media is black and white. And it's really easy to say you left your baby, you deserve to rot in prison. I know some, depending on where you are in the country as well, those opinions may vary. But that really just stuck with me at the core of this film. And what I think you do so effectively is giving us an insight into what Gail's life is like, spending time with her husband, spending time with their kids, and getting a piece and picture of what that's like. And then there's some pretty heartbreaking moments as well when they kind of reveal the autopsy of the child that they found. My heart sank. I had chills. It is such a complex issue, and there's so many nuances to it that, as far as court proceedings have gone, really have not examined. And I'd love to hear, how did you first start hearing about it?
Well, I I thought it was really interesting because, especially with just the fact that a lot of these girls aren't having typical pregnancy symptoms.
Mm,
So like sometimes still spotting in their periods, not potentially gaining a lot of weight, not having morning sickness, nobody noticing. I mean, I had heard an example of looking at like if you have like a lump somewhere on your body and you're too scared to go to the doctor in case they tell you that it might be cancer. I mean, there's certain things I think in our lives that are very easy and kind of self-preserving to deny,
mm,
and I think if you're not seeing typical signs and you are a kid and nobody's noticing at the same time, it would be very easy to push something that is scary out of your mind. I think we do it all the time in our lives to different degrees with different types of things. And so I just thought that's very interesting to me, how we can deny things to ourselves, how other people might not want to see things, all of this. And then I didn't interview Gail until after the trial prep. I was watching the trial prep and filming that before I actually did a sit down with Gail.
mm,
And I found it kind of hard to wrap my mind around also, like at times in the way that she would answer questions and not remember. But
mm,
I think when I spent time with her, speaking to her, the more she opened up to me and just kind of, I had a lot of aha moments in that where I just really felt like a girl who was scared of confrontation, didn't know how to ask for help, was really hoping that somebody would notice and ask her and kind of like rescue her from the situation that she
mm,
didn't know how to navigate herself. And I just found all this really interesting. And also how a lot of these girls can come from families where there is some neglect and there's not proper communication. And I think that a lot of that stuff is communication is learned, in
mm,
families, like a modeling after your parents. And if you don't have that, then it's harder to ask for help. And it's also like, especially if you feel like there's going to be some shame or rejection within the people closest to you. I mean, the
mm,
biggest thing for me, which is part of the reason I wanted to do this story, is just thinking of my niece is 18. I
mm,
remember being 18 myself. If I or my niece had nobody to talk to, felt like we couldn't tell anybody we were pregnant, I
mm.
mean, that to me feels heartbreaking. And that's the story I kind of wanted to tell about the girl who doesn't have anybody they can tell in their life.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think religion
Hmm.
is such an interesting focal point, because on one hand, you have this immense fear of
Hmm.
judgment, whether it's damnation, it's a child out of wedlock, what it might mean to your community, how that affects your parents. There's so many levels of shame that come with religion.
Hmm.
And on the other side, though, you also have a place where people are filled spiritually, where in some cases people are willing to overlook or understand and move past some
Hmm.
of your past or things like it. Just, can you speak at all to that balance of how you saw religion kind of play out in this film?
Yeah. That to me was very, very interesting. The fact that, for Gail, her faith was such a huge part of this thing that like saved her as a kid. Like she went to church when she was like in grade 3 in order to get out of her house and have a community and to feel safe, you know. And then it's there that she also, you know, that's kind of where the shame developed around the fact that she was having premarital sex. She felt like she was the sinner. Like this is, and then she saw other girls like get pregnant and then not be able, you know, be kind of shamed in front of the congregation. But then it's also, even through this whole journey with everything that happened, her faith hasn't really changed, you know? It's also this thing that got her through.
Mhm.
So it's very complex, and it's interesting how it can be like negative in certain ways, but then also positive at the same time. I think when it comes, I can really only speak to, you know, Gail's situation here. I do know that Gail and Mark, they did go to a church that they didn't feel like they were accepted in after all this happened. And the Cowboy Church was very accepting, and they took people from all walks of life. And I think they talk a lot about it's the sin, not the sinner. You
Mhm.
know? Yeah, I
That
don't know
that
if that answers your
phrase,
question.
no, the sin, not the sinner, that it just adds to so much of what is so complex about this case
Yeah.
and cases like these, because I sit here feeling like there are mass shooters, there are rapists, there are murderers who we know willingly did these evil things, and the sentence is the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Mm-hmm.
so hard to wrap my head around, the
Mm-hmm.
reality of it, the sadness of it.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same sense, spending that time with Gail like you did, and spending time with the people around her, you don't get this impression that she's a monster. You
Mm-hmm.
feel remorse, you feel guilt, and you
Mm-hmm.
also see her struggling to try to take accountability and to try to take this on head first.
Mm-hmm.
And in the criminal justice system, it's just something that I think this shines a great light on, whether intentionally or not. That you know, this is why I think a film like this matters, and why cases like these matter, and understanding anything from pregnancy denial to looking past what's black and white, and
Mm-hmm.
treating each case with the sane and the amount of judgment that it should carry.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me is always a striking aspect of great filmmaking. When you're almost frustrated, there's this feeling of like I'm upset. I'm
Mm-hmm.
upset because of how the world is. I think you do such a great job of examining authenticity in all the people in this film. Because again, being authentic and being honest does not always look pretty. It's not
Mm-hmm.
always going to be comfortable either. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what's so deeply moving about this film and
Mm-hmm.
your filmmaking, about how these characters start to you start weaving some of their stories together. You feel for them and you understand them empathetically. I was curious to know a bit about some of your upbringing. There's certainly in the last 5 to 10 years felt like this surge in true crime, in people taking an interest in certain court cases, and really getting
Mm-hmm.
a clue into that legal process. Were there any cases where you were growing up as a younger woman that really jumped out to you?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I was so much drawn to true crime as I was doing photojournalism before my first film, Jacinta, and I got a grant to photograph aging in prison. Um, so I went into the prison system photographing like elderly people, and I spent a lot of time with elderly men and three elderly men and an elderly woman in a women's prison. And I was just really blown away by the prison. That's kind of how I entered it, where I was like, wow, this is such a different world, you know, and also seeing these people who had, you know, they had committed murder. These are people like, you know, something, there had been trauma in their childhood and they had snapped or something had happened. It was more of just
Mhm.
kind of looking at the prison system where someone has been in prison for like 35, 40 years
Sure.
and like where are they at in their elderly age and how did they look back on what they did? And like
Hmm.
that's kind of what it was about. And I found that you know, they're not, even when they commit murder, I don't know, this might be controversial to say, but there was definitely like a feeling of these are actually just kind of like normal people, which made it kind of like anybody's capable
Sure.
of murder, you know, anybody's capable of doing like something horrific, you know,
Sure.
and it was just like a very interesting world to me, just the fact that prison is so separated from our societies, just outside of cities, and then how people end up in prison and what brings them there, and so much trauma in these people's backgrounds. And of course, Jacinta was about addiction, and there was so much
Hmm.
trauma in her background. So to me, it was just kind of like having this new understanding of, and then we lock people up, and there are certain crimes that don't feel like they deserve really like sentences like this, like
No,
especially with people with
absolutely.
addiction that are circling in and out. So that's kind of how I first came to it. And I found myself also really, I found it kind of rewarding to go in, tell people's stories who their stories have not been told. And they want their stories told. I think a lot of people want to like talk to someone and like kind of share. And I felt like it was nice, I don't know, to spend time with people who just kind of want to share their experiences. I know that doesn't really answer your
Well, no,
question. I guess I don't watch a lot of true crime, to be honest,
mhm,
because there's a lot of like I have a hard time with anything that's too sensational, too entertainment based when it
totally.
comes to like crime, or like if there's a victim involved, or anything like that. So
Sure,
I think the true crime I do is difficult in a way to even place in our marketplace these days, because I think it is a little bit more empathetic,
sure.
and it's maybe got a little like less traditional twists and turns. Yeah, in a
That's
different
really
way.
that's no, that's very interesting to hear. And I
Yeah.
think, something I heard in what you were saying, these people who do want their stories told, I think it goes
Hmm.
back to what you mentioned a moment ago, communication.
Yeah.
And were these people who did they have the ability to communicate effectively with someone when they were
Hmm.
younger? And then this
Hmm.
feeling too of in a lot of these cases when you've been in prison for 30, 40 years, when
Hmm.
you're spending your life there and how that affects you and how you look back. I'm sure there's an aspect too of you want to help keep people from being in the same situation that maybe you found yourself in. You hope
Hmm.
that the younger generations communicate. If you are not doing well, if something's happening, like I so much of that it just feels unfortunately true. Just
Well, it's
looking at the conditions of someone's background.
And that's a lot of what Jacinta was about. It was about generational trauma and generational learning. Someone like Jacinta, and I don't know if your viewers have seen that film, but it is about a mother and daughter incarcerated together. And Jacinta, like, I followed her out into her life after she got out of prison. And a lot of how Jacinta ended up in the prison system was directly related to trying to stay with her mother, who was going through the prison system. And I think there's some similarities in Baby Doe as well, that like, Gail like did not learn how to communicate, didn't feel like she had anybody in her life to talk to. And I think you can see that generational stuff in her mother and father as well.
Mhm.
And even with Courtney, Gail's daughter, she talks about like
Mhm.
she is trying to learn how to communicate in a way that she never really learned from her parents. And now she sees the value in that because of what's happened with her mother. I'm very interested to understand how, the connection between what we learn and what we do and where we end up, and how we are just kind of accumulation of all the experiences that come before us and we're taught,
Sure,
like there's so much of my mother in me, there's so much of my nana in me, and I am breaking cycles in my own family, but also I'm probably continuing cycles too. But I was fortunate enough that I was never really at risk at going to prison, you know,
sure,
or, some of these having addictions or anyways, but I can see how that could happen.
sure. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. When you came out of this film, what did you take away that maybe you didn't have beforehand, or maybe it was something surprising as far as maybe how you look at the world a little bit, or as far as some of the stories you want to continue to tell, perhaps?
I think the denial aspect of this story was really interesting to me, because I think the denial and how there's certain things like I can see in my own life even that I might not want to deal with, or that I would just put off, and how that can happen, and how it's just an example of something that can be very dangerous if you don't deal with it. I think sometimes with the films I work on, I don't know exactly why I'm interested in it or why I'm drawn to it at the beginning. And then it kind of reveals itself in the edit or during filming that I'm like, oh, wow, yeah, I feel I have a lot in common when it comes to like, even in my family, we're super loving and I'm very close to my family. But I think communication, the way we communicate, had some space to, grow and, you know, improve,
Sure.
prove.
I I've
Yeah,
got time for just one last
sure.
question here, but I'm just curious to know what beliefs, if any, this film and the filmmaking process challenged of yours.
I think I don't know, it made me angry. I think I was already kind of like upset with various things, but there were certain things I think specifically that happened in the course of filming that I just felt like were very unfair and not right. And I think the whole idea of an eye for an eye always kind of challenged me. It's like taking a life for a life. There's something that just feels really wrong in that. And after filming so much, but also spending time with the family after, I just feel even more strongly now about that and have
Sure.
felt like it just, who are we to take a life?
I completely hear you on that. It is
Yeah.
as sad and upsetting as it might be that that child was lost.
Hmm.
There's a reality that a woman who's lived a full life, who has support, who has people that also depend on her, is now being put away.
Hmm.
And that I'm with you there. It doesn't feel fair. It doesn't sit
Hmm.
right. There can be a punishment, but if
Hmm.
you're going to affect so many other lives,
Hmm.
and this is that same thing, that cycle of abuse, whether it's with substances, other things, it
Hmm.
is so hard to distance yourself from that when you look
Hmm.
at it with such a myopic view of, yes, you did this, so you deserve this.
Hmm.
And you don't think about the ripple that that creates and how that in itself could create more generational trauma there.
Oh, for sure. For
So
sure.
I
Yeah, of
really, really appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate too in the
course.
film that I appreciate you sharing with me some of your anger and frustration. It doesn't show up in the film, and I mean that in a good way because
Hmm.
you present
Hmm.
everything factually. You let people build their own opinions around it, and so for me, that is always the mark of a successful film and one that really
Thank
does
you.
challenge the audience. And so I'm really looking forward to not only sharing this talk of ours but sharing my thoughts on the film and helping get that out in front of people because it's a discussion that certainly needs to be continued. So I really appreciate you shining a light on it.
Well, honestly, the biggest compliment is that when I hear that people are having really robust conversations around this film, I mean, that was the intention. Like, I have my own feelings about it, but I think it's more than fair for someone to have a very different opinion than me. And I think having those conversations are really interesting. And I think it's really important because I don't think we're having enough conversations about this.
Absolutely.
Um,
I
yeah.
think that's how you kind of hopefully move both sides to more of a middle
Hmm.
ground, or at least an understanding where every party knows what's happening and they can understand the intricacies of it. And then we can maybe arrive at something together that feels a little bit more just, perhaps.
And just I know you have to go, but I think the
No.
one thing that has been interesting in some of the conversations we've had in Q&As is that even if I do have people come and they talk more about, well, this happened to the baby and this blah blah blah, and I think she deserves something. I think there has been a lot of people who, even if they are strong on the other side, they don't
Mhm.
feel that her sentence needed to be so long, like it didn't feel just at the same time. So it's interesting that people still, for the most part, have been landing there, even if they get there in a different way.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. I can't thank you enough, Jessica, for
Thank
taking the
you.
time today. This was such a thrilling conversation. So happy to meet you. Jacinta is now something I will be going back and watching,
Oh, thanks.
based off of you as a filmmaker. I'm really looking forward to that. So thank you for taking the time. Baby Doe is playing the Seattle International Film Festival. I will be sharing coverage for it, and I cannot wait. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.